Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Cary Nedermann from Texas for the second time, because in the last series on the Middle Ages, Professor Nedermann was speaking on Marsilius of Padua, but he is not only the expert on Marsilius of Padua, but even more so, I think, on Machiavelli, since, as we've been just talking before the start of this event, Professor Nedermann wrote his undergraduate essay on Machiavelli, and he said to me he's been teaching Machiavelli for over 40 years now. So he's a really internationally recognized expert on Niccolo Machiavelli. And today, Professor Nedermann is going to talk specifically about tyranny in Machiavelli's writings. So, Professor Nedermann, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank you for the invitation to do this, because I wound up doing a lot more in terms of analysis and found out some very surprising things about tyranny and Machiavelli. So some of which I'll talk about. I'll talk about today. I'll try to keep this. I cut a lot of the original paper, and I'll try to keep it within the 45 minutes that we generally do for this. And if I go over, I've got some places in my notes that where I can make cuts. So because I'll be curious how people react to this. As I said, I discovered a few things that I certainly that I didn't know and I thought were quite interesting. The first of which is a kind of a fun fact, and that's namely that Pierre Bayle, in his Historical and Critical Dictionary, evidently coined the term Machiavellism, which he regarded to be synonymous with, quote, governing tyrannically by violence and fraud. Of course, Bayle built on a tradition extending back at least as far as Anti-Machiavel by Innocent Genet in the 16th century, for whom Machiavelli formulated, quote, not a political, but a tyrannical science, unquote. Whether we credit him or Bayle or someone else entirely, such as Frederick of Prussia, for solidifying Machiavelli's reputation as a tyrannophile, his name has long been intimately associated with tyranny. Now, in the original paper, there's a long discussion of the secondary literature on this, which I've left aside. Given the widespread connection drawn between Machiavelli and tyranny, then, there is certain irony in the recognition of the fact that he employs what might be termed tyrant language across the range of his works relatively seldom. I'm going to use the term tyrant language to encompass all of those Italian terms that are related to tyrant, tyranny, and so forth. Anyway, he employs what might be termed tyrant language across the range of his works relatively seldom. Indeed, it comes as somewhat surprising that the text by Machiavelli most commonly cited as evidence of his tyrannical tendencies, The Prince, contains no uses of the words tyrant or tyranny or any such thing whatsoever. By contrast, tyranny is a recurring, albeit not dominant, theme in his two major works on republican government, the Discourses on Livy and the History of Florence. These general observations led me to an even more surprising discovery. Nowhere in the vast body of scholarly literature on Machiavelli's thought has anyone of whom I'm aware attempted a systematic inventory of his deployment of tyrant language throughout the full array of his writings, including not only his better-known theoretical works, but also his literary, epistolary, and administrative compositions. Thus, the purpose of the present paper is to undertake, amongst other things, is to undertake just such a survey. In particular, I tackle this enterprise in three ways. First, I provide a census of Machiavelli's reliance on the discourse of tyranny in the totality of his written corpus. Second, I propose a typology of these usages in order to facilitate an appreciation of the various ways in which tyranny appears in his oeuvre. Third, I offer a more detailed analysis of passages from his writings that illustrate and illuminate the application of tyrant language in several specific instances. My intended project is not, I must stress, simply an exercise in philological or discourse analysis. Rather, I contend that significant theoretical implications flow from such an examination of Machiavelli's use of tyrant language. First, and here they are. First, when one casts a wide net, one finds that there is precious little evidence for Machiavelli's adherence to a single, entirely consistent and coherent theory of tyranny. Second, the application of tyrant language sometimes extends not merely to individuals, but to collective groups. Third, while either the people, the popolo, or the nobility, the grandi or automati, may occasionally authorize the creation of a tyrant, the result is ordinarily disastrous for the faction that employs this strategy. Now, as a prelude to the examination of these theoretical claims, however, I want to commence with a simple numerical report. By my count, Machiavelli uses tyrant language 150 times in the sum of his writings. This is a quite infinitesimal number, considering that the entirety of Machiavelli's corpus in Corrado Vivanti's standard edition of the opera runs to nearly 3,000 pages, and that's exclusive of critical apparatus. Machiavelli wrote a lot, in other words. Moreover, references to tyranny are unevenly distributed, depending upon the genre of the text. Indeed, even within a particular work, tyranny language is sometimes bunched into concentrated locations. Employing a notional classification of Machiavelli's varied writings, the distribution breaks down something as follows. In his professional, personal, and occasional prose, he uses tyrant language, tyranny language 19 times. Now, of course, that includes, for example, his legations, his reports to his masters in Florence during his various diplomatic journeys, and that itself is a massive work. So 19 times for that. Literary works, that is to say, works of poetry and theater, 4 times. Treatises, 127 times, that is to say, the standard writings we think of as his major works, 127 times, including 80 in the Discourses on Livy and 44 in the History of Florence. Thus, the overwhelming number of instances, well in excess of 80%, in which Machiavelli discusses tyranny may be located in just 2 texts, both of which, interestingly, are heavily focused on republican government. But are his various invocations of the appellation tyrant all of a piece? The evidence suggests that this question must be answered in the negative. Obviously, it is beyond the scope of the present paper to itemize all 150 of Machiavelli's uses of tyrant language, though, in fact, I do have such a complete itemization if anybody's interested. But careful examination of these sources provides ample support for the conclusion that he employs the terminology related to tyranny equivocally when tracked across his oeuvre. I suggest that a rough taxonomy constructed along the following lines helps us to classify the diverse fashions in which he makes use of tyranny. 1, as an essentially descriptive term applied to specific despotic rulers. 2, as a form of government directly contrasted with a republic. 3, as a constitutional form in its own right. 4, as a characteristic of how groups wield their superior political positions. 5, and more rarely, as a personal attribute or quality that invites disdain or invective. In turn, these categories are nevertheless united by 3 questions of special import. First, what is the source of tyranny? Second, by what means can tyranny be maintained? Third, how does liberation from tyrants occur? I do not mean to imply that Machiavelli's use of tyrant language completely lacks theoretical coherence. However, considerable chaff requires disposal before we can appreciate the kernels of seed present within. As we delve into his writings, we encounter a quite complex and multivariant account of tyranny deployed there. Still, we do not fully comprehend Machiavelli's contribution unless we appreciate the linguistic subtleties that permeate his arguments. So, who were Machiavelli's favorite tyrants? From a purely quantitative perspective, among contemporaries, he most often identifies 3 specific figures by name or location as tyrannical. Giovanni Bentivogli, of Bologna, 6 times. Pandolfo Petrucci of Siena, 6 times. Gianpaolo Baglioni of Perugia, 7 times. Now, why did Machiavelli devote considerable attention to this triad? Not surprisingly, the answer rests with the circumstances of Italian politics during his time. Popes Alexander VI and Julius II, with an assist from Cesare Borgia, had devoted considerable attention and resources to returning to papal control those cities, including Bologna and Perugia, which had once been part of the so-called patrimony of St. Peter, that is to say, the papal states. Julius indeed earned his moniker, the warrior pope, as a result of leading military expeditions himself against former ecclesiastical territories. These were all related to attempts to bring such territories back under the aegis of some other external authority, not to hand them their liberty. For the relationship between freedom and tyranny, we must turn to 2 other tyrants who caught Machiavelli's eye: the Duke of Athens, discussed at length in the history of Florence, and Appius Claudius in ancient Rome, a subject of extensive interest in the discourses. The Duke of Athens and Appius afforded especially apt illustrations of major lessons that Machiavelli derives from his treatment of tyranny and of the predicaments which tyrants are compelled to confront. It must be emphasized that these precepts are mainly negative. Neither the Duke nor Appius were ultimately successful in sustaining their efforts to exercise tyranny. As is often the case for Machiavelli, however, political failure can offer a more pertinent and instructive guide than success. What can we learn from Machiavelli's analyses of the careers of his 2 most prominent tyrants historically? I'll commence with Appius, whose conduct receives detailed attention in the discourses, but who's not mentioned by Machiavelli elsewhere in his corpus, at least of which I'm aware. On Machiavelli's account, which should be treated without reference to concerns about historical veracity, and that's so often true when Machiavelli makes historical claims. The story of Appius offers an arresting tutorial to anyone wishing to, quote, maintain a free republic, as well as to those who desire to subdue it, unquote. The tale starts off with an effort to quell the disputes and contentions between the nobles and people regarding the formulation of new laws in Rome, unquote. By sending to Athens to seek there the Solonic statutes that govern the Athenian polis, with the intention that they might provide a model for Roman reforms. Upon the return of the ambassadors, a committee composed of 10 citizens, the decemvirs, was established to facilitate the drafting of a legal code for Rome. One of the members of this committee was Appius Claudius. In order to assure that they could impose the laws that they devised unimpeded by external pressure, the decemvirs, who were only to serve for a year, suppressed all of the institutions and practices that the Romans had invented following the ejection of the Tarquin kings, not least the magistracies of the consuls and tribunes, rendering themselves the effective absolute authority in the city. And Appius, in turn, arrogated this power to himself, or so Machiavelli reports, with the support of the plebs, who had previously perceived him to be a cruel persecutor, that's Machiavelli's term, of the people. Indeed, Machiavelli says Appius was thought to have been a man transformed, having acquired, quote, a new nature. However, the decemvirate began to beat down, and it's literally batter, the people, to the extent that they appealed to the nobles for relief, a group hardly inclined to lend its assistance. For its part, the nobility was perfectly happy with the affliction of the popular faction and feared that, quote, if the decemvirs voluntarily renounced their magistracy, it would occur that the tribunes of the plebs would be reinstituted, unquote. Unfortunately, however, Appius's despotic manner resulted in his own downfall, as violence spread through both the Roman army and the people, who by threat of force ejected the decemvirs and restored both Rome's traditional offices and ancient liberty. Now, having recounted the events of Appius's rise and decline, Machiavelli draws an extensive series of conclusions that focus on the foundations of tyranny. First, tyrannical government is the direct and perpetual result of the ineliminable clash of interests between the noble and popular factions that exist within any state as a result of, quote, the excessive desire of the people to be free and the excessive desire of the nobility to command, unquote, a theme that resonates throughout Machiavelli's political theory. In the case of the Decemvirate, each party had as its goal the destruction of the institution that most vexed it, the consulate for the plebs, the tribunate for the grandi, and so invested tyrannical power in the decemvirs, which Appius then consolidated in his own hands. Initially, the Decemvirate gave each party what it fervently wanted, the suppression of the two magistracies, which might otherwise also have afforded some elements of checks on the power of the 10. Initially, Appius, quote, seemed to the plebs to have turned to the people and would beat down the nobility, and thus the people favored him, unquote. This proved their undoing, since they unleashed a tyrant who proceeded to crush the popular faction itself, leaving it with no one to whom it could appeal to restore liberty and to side instead with the nobility. Machiavelli instructs that aspirants to tyranny are always safer maintaining the support of the people and eliminating the optimates decisively, suggesting that all successful tyrants follow this path in order to suppress republics and to impose their tyrannical wills on a city. Appius's downfall, of course, stemmed from the fact he reversed the order of this strategy, abandoning the people and aligning himself with the nobles, an observation that leads directly to Machiavelli's second major point. By making himself an enemy of the people who had brought him to power and a friend to the nobility whose wish it was to dominate and whose ambition and avarice, that's Machiavelli's words, are so great that he never possesses sufficient resources to gratify them. Appius thereby brought about his own ruin. If he had done otherwise, he would have enjoyed sufficient support from the people to maintain his power and solidify his position. In sum, Appius's lack of sound political acumen was the immediate cause of his eventual failure, although Machiavelli also apportions blame to the poor judgment exercised by the plebs in placing their trust in the tyrant's presumed advocacy on behalf of their faction. In some regards, the story of the other tyrant to whom Machiavelli devotes considerable attention represents an even worse instance of incompetence in the form of Walter de Brienne the Sixth, generally known as the Duke of Athens. Again, keeping in mind the caveat that for heuristic purposes, Machiavelli's historical narrative can be more fanciful than accurate, he recounts in the history of Florence, his native city's failed attempts to restore its control over Lucca via military engagements with rival claimant Pisa in 1341 and again in 1342 that proved disastrous. The Florentine popolo grew restless, especially since the warfare had drained the city's coffers, in response to which the Grandi called upon King Robert of Naples for aid. The king sent to Florence the Duke of Athens, upon whom the nobles bestowed multiple titles and offices, the better to induce fear among the ordinary citizens. The nobles, Machiavelli says, quote, thought the time had come when by ruining the city, they could put out the fire that was burning themselves. In their judgment, continuing the quote, in their judgment, there was no other way to master the populace that had persecuted them than to put themselves under a prince who would restrain the people and favor the nobles, unquote. Initially, the Duke managed to placate both the popular and elite factions in the city, although the middling strata of citizens were troubled by his conduct. As the Duke's power grew, however, the nobles who had placed so much confidence in him grew increasingly disenchanted, whereas the popular faction became more enamored of him, since he, quote, turned to benefiting the plebs, thinking that their aid could preserve his tyranny, unquote. Indeed, quote, with the people's consent, he was chosen ruler for life and taken up and carried by the multitude, which was shouting his name, unquote. Once the Duke's position was confirmed, he proceeded to appease the plebs and to eliminate systematically perceived threats, especially from the noble class. Now, thus far, it might appear that the Duke had followed to a T Machiavelli's prescriptions for success as a tyrant. But Machiavelli says that Walter had a, quote, tyrannical animal, a tyrannical spirit. In effect, he could not control himself from extending his grasp. For instance, he imposed exorbitant taxes and ordered the execution of anyone who objected. Florentines regarded the latter acts, in Machiavelli's view, as a particular affront to their liberty. Consequently, and to no great surprise, conspiracies against the Duke began to foment in all sectors of Florentine society. Ultimately, the people succeeded in ousting the Duke. Who then was to take the reins of government? An initial power-sharing agreement between the nobles and the people quickly collapsed on account of the arrogance of the nobility. Offended by the determination of the Grandi to recover the dominion they regarded as appropriate and proper to their station, the ordinary citizens, quote, lamented that the removal of one tyrant, that is to say the Duke, led 1,000 to spring up, unquote, i.e. the nobility. Civil war ensued. The commoners, without other resources, overthrew the Duke in less than 2 years. Since the people won by their own efforts alone, Machiavelli remarks, quote, the nobles continued to be deprived of high offices, and if they wished to get them again, they were forced in their conduct, their spirit, and their way of life, not merely to imitate men of the people, but to appear to be so in every facet of their self-presentation. The victory left a large cache of weapons in the hands of the popular party, which used them against its rivals to the extent that, quote, our ancient nobility was overcome and surrendered itself to the will of the people. Continues, a bridle had been put upon those who through their pride and ambition seemed to have caused the trouble, unquote. The direct result of the plebs obtaining the upper hand was the ruin of the nobility, Machiavelli concludes. The Duke's failure then provides an alternate case study in how tyranny collapses. In contrast with Appius, the Duke had seemingly followed the course plotted by Machiavelli of shifting from initial noble support to the approbation of the people. But Florence's tyrant did not, and perhaps could not, exercise the restraint necessary to keep the popular faction at his side. Thus, he managed to alienate all the groups within the city that might have afforded him a reliable power base. The Duke's miscalculations not only led to his own destruction, but also to open violent conflict between the contending Florentine parties. Now, although Machiavelli mainly ascribes tyranny to specific individuals, they are not, in his view, the only ones capable of exercising power tyrannically. Recall, for example, that while Appius is considered a tyrant, he in fact instigated the creation of a group, the decemvirs, who developed into a sort of collective tyranny. Machiavelli points to a number of such examples in which not a single man, but a faction or party tyrannized the state. This might involve a relatively small number of people holding magistracies or positions of unrivaled authority, such as the decemvirate, but it might also encompass much larger groups. Thus, in The Art of War, Machiavelli cautions that those who, quote, commit tyrannical injury in order to live at all times by means of warfare as a profession are altogether ministers of tyranny, unquote. That is, professional soldiers have their own sets of interests that do not coincide with the public good, and they possess the force to impose their collective will on a state. A professional army has inherently tyrannical tendencies. Machiavelli ascribes similar inclinations to other groups as well. In Florence, he says, the population experienced both, quote, the tyranny of the Ghibellines while it had lived under their government, and the tyrannical ways of the Guelphs when they ruled the city. Likewise, he speaks of the tyranny of the powerful, potenti, in their quest to oppress the humble. He talks about Piero de' Medici, along with his other followers, who, quote, were accustomed to live tyrannically rather than in accordance with Florence's laws and the will of its citizens. And he talks about the exploits of Pelopidas, who liberated Thebes, quote, from its tyrants and conspired not only against 2, but against 10 tyrants, namely, quote, some of the first citizens of Thebes who, wishing to be tyrants, had seized tyranny in the city. Note that in all of these cases, collective tyranny was exercised by members of the nobility of one sort or another. By contrast, Machiavelli never refers to popular tyranny at all in any of his works. Rather, in every instance in which the people were implicated in supporting tyrannical regimes, they invest power in a tyrant, now perhaps foolishly, as we've seen, instead of exercising it themselves by means of some fashion of direct rule. Why? I can think of several possibilities. First, a large group cannot organize itself adequately to coordinate in the same way as a small collectivity, such as the decemvirs or even the nobility. The people need a tyrant to act on their behalf. Second, the people are not required to behave tyrannically. Their sheer numbers are ordinarily sufficient to keep the nobility's desire to dominate in check without resorting to the techniques to which tyrants resort, as Machiavelli points out on more than one occasion. Third, the people's fundamental love of liberty renders them simply and definitionally incapable of exercising collective tyranny, unlike the nobility with its innate disposition to command and dictate to the block of ordinary citizens. These factors, I must stress, are not mutually exclusive. They are speculative, however. Indeed, they may all play a role in Machiavelli's refusal to label a government controlled by the people tyrannical. Certainly, it appears that Machiavelli evinces no fear of the tyranny of the majority that has so bedeviled many political theorists throughout the ages. Now, without saying that this realization confirms the work of John McCormick and others who read Machiavelli through a democratic lens, the absence of any mention of popular group tyranny in his writings surely adds credence to their interpretation. Now, previously in this chapter, in this paper, I proposed that the place of tyranny in Machiavelli's overarching theoretical framework might best be understood in relation to questions about the origin, perpetuation, and collapse of tyrannical governments. So whence does tyranny originate? First question, according to Machiavelli. It seems to me that he identifies 5 discrete courses across the range of his writings. The first of these is among the most conventional explanations, namely, a monarchy or principality transforms into a tyranny on account of quasi-natural temporal change on the Polybian model, according to which the heirs of the original king become corrupt. And of course, at the beginning of the first discourse, he adapts Polybius's idea of anacyclosis in talking about constitutional change. A second reason is related to the personal qualities of character, either ingrained in a person or acquired by some manner of psychological transformation. Some men simply possess a tyrannical spirit that drives them to attain mastery, while others turn to tyranny as a reaction to the circumstances they encounter, such as maltreatment by their compatriots. And he actually gives Julius Caesar as an example of that. Third, tyrants gain power as a result of violent usurpation, whether that involves a successful internal coup or the invasion of a territory from without. In either case, the population as a whole is compelled at sword's point to submit to a ruler who holds sway over it. Fourth, tyranny is introduced by a superior political authority, such as occurred with the Duke of Athens, whose appointment in Florence was initially arranged by the King of Naples. Finally, tyrants can be the creatures of clashing factions, especially as instruments of the optimate's ambition to dominate or the people's desire for liberty. This is probably the cause of tyranny that most interests Machiavelli, but it is also one that readily misfires in just the myriad ways he describes. In sum, the root of tyranny is multifaceted, and its materialization seems difficult to predict with any strong confidence. Next, we may inquire about the maintenance of tyrannical power once it has been established. I can see 3 possible replies. The first involves the continued support for or confirmation of the tyrant's position, however it was acquired, by some superior political authority. Machiavelli offers an illustration of this point in the history of Florence, when considering how Lombardy was governed during the High and later Middle Ages. He explains that during this period, Italy had been abandoned by the emperor, as a result of which, quote, many cities became free and many were seized by tyrants, unquote. Some years later, a struggle ensued between the papacy and the empire over which of them actually held sway over particular cities, or at any rate, the ones that were ruled by tyrants. Initially, the Pope, quote, decreed that all of the tyrants of Lombardy should retain the cities they had usurped with legal title, unquote. Whereupon the emperor followed suit, giving, quote, the cities that they were ruling to all of the tyrants who were in possession of the cities belonging to the church, so that they could possess them with imperial authority. And there's a funny line I didn't quote, or a quip, about the emperor seeing no reason why, if the church could give away his cities, he couldn't give away the cities of the church. Thus, in both cases, the Italian tyrants were able to retain their possessions by the grant of an overlord. A second way in which tyrants persist is probably the most obvious: the use of violence, actual or threatened, against potential adversaries among the populace to induce submission. According to Machiavelli, quote, any mutation of government must necessarily be followed by some memorable execution against the enemies of the present condition. And whoever makes himself a tyrant and does not kill Brutus will not maintain himself for a long time, unquote. Alternatively, a tyrant can compel deference by the destruction of one of the two classes over whom he rules, as did Clearchus of Heraclea, who had the nobility massacred upon coming to his office, to the extreme satisfaction of the people. The last method might be deployed by a tyrant to retain power follows on from the case of Clearchus. Please the people, but don't please them too much. For the most part, ordinary citizens, quote, who constitute the overwhelming majority, desire liberty as to live in greater security, unquote, and thus, quote, are readily gratified by institutions and laws that confirm the tyrant's power while comprehending the general security, unquote. Machiavelli repeatedly stresses, the people are a more reliable prop for tyranny than the nobility, but only when their liberty is kept within bounds set by the tyrant himself. So, how and why does tyrannical government disintegrate? One cause takes us back to the tyrants of the Italian cities of Machiavelli's own time. Their downfall, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, occurred when a stronger authority, such as Pope Julius, removed them from their positions by the exercise of superior might. A second explanation stems from a tyrant's failure to appease adequately the desires of the faction on which he relies for his power, whether the nobility or the people. As the example of the Duke of Athens illustrates all too well, vacillation over which party to support, and in particular alienating the masses, ultimately produces a counter-reaction in the form of outright rebellion, which the tyrant was ordinarily unable to suppress on his own. Third, a tyrant who overreaches in the satisfaction of his own base desires, say by committing flagrant crimes against womenfolk, creates such widespread outrage that a population will strenuously oppose him by fomenting conspiracies that engender his removal from office. Permit me, by way of conclusion, to revisit the issue that I posed near the beginning of this paper. Do Machiavelli's widely scattered remarks about tyranny amount to a theoretically developed position? The answer to this question is more complex than it may seem at first glance. Certainly, elements of Machiavelli's treatment of tyrants are intended to be highly pragmatic, reflecting the approach that characterizes so much of his writing. Yet some aspects of his analysis of tyranny crystallize around two abiding features of his thought: that the humori of the grandi and the popolo set them in an inherently antagonistic relationship, and that the the predicament confronted by any government, including a tyrannical one, entails management of that conflict. In turn, the chances of tyranny prevailing are exceedingly slim, regardless of whether tyrannical power is exercised by one man or by a group, because the calculations required to do so are so fine. Machiavelli's favorite tyrants, Appius and the Duke of Athens, are brought down by their miscues or their inability to repulse external threats by combative popes and powerful warlords. The tyrant, even the most adept one, can barely avoid making enemies somehow. A plethora of traps are set out for him. More generally, the tyrants discussed by Machiavelli seem not to possess the characteristic of virtù, which, as we know from the Prince, is the quality absolutely necessary for a single man who acquires and retains a state. One might speculate that this reflects a reason why Machiavelli never invokes tyrant language in that tract. A tyrant possessing virtù is simply an oxymoron, although this is not a claim on which I'm prepared to insist too adamantly. The other theoretical factor that draws one's attention is Machiavelli's repeated emphasis on the people as perhaps the premier deciding factor in the success or failure of tyrannical government. Now, this cuts in several directions. First, individual tyrants can emerge and preserve themselves with the support of the people. Second, tyrants who do not maintain popular backing, either by switching their loyalty to the nobility or by attempting to navigate a path that relies on neither faction, are virtually assured to face ruin. Third, while tyranny may arise as a result of the people's acquiescence or endorsement, the popolo itself never exercises tyrannical power collectively, in contrast to other factions. On the one hand, these points hardly amount to a full-throated embrace of the populism sometimes ascribed to Machiavelli. On the other hand, it does not seem too far-fetched to say that Machiavelli's confidence in the people outstrips his regard for other factions, let alone for a tyrant himself. Admittedly, this is a chastened conclusion, but one that seems most warranted by the evidence that I have examined. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And plenty of time.
Yes, we have time for discussion, questions, remarks. So if anyone has a question or a remark, you can unmute yourself and speak, unless you want to raise your virtual hand. That's possible as well.
I would love to ask a question because with Mateusz, we're also in this project Encyclopedia Tyrannica, so we're compiling an encyclopedia on tyrannic rule, and we're also covering very shortly the main literature and take on tyranny, despotism, and so on. And when I was writing my entry on Montesquieu a while back, I did see that Montesquieu made a little bit of an Orientalist distinction between the concept of tyranny and despotism, he said. And I was wondering if Machiavelli had any use for the concept of despotism, or he disregarded from the beginning, because I don't really, or use them synonymously completely. I have never read him in the original, so I was wondering, does Machiavelli in one way distinguish between despotism and tyranny? And if such, what is the conceptual difference between those two concepts? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. The short answer is no. Yeah, he doesn't. I've just finished editing a huge research handbook in the history of political thought, and one of the entries, of course, was on Montesquieu. In fact, the author of that entry talks about that fairly considerably, and about Montesquieu's use of Machiavelli, but it doesn't ring true in Machiavelli. Basically, the only two descriptions you see only three for rule by a single man is prince or principality, is kingship, and is, as I said, more rarely tyranny. And none of those equates to despotism. And I don't think, I'd have to go back and check, but I don't even think that there is I'm trying to think what an Italian word, a 16th century, a Florentine Italian word would be for despotism. But that's something I'd have to go back and look at. But certainly, if there's any language of despotism there, it's by no means dominant or very important.
Right. Ron, you have a question.
It's my turn, or?
Yes.
Well, I wonder, I mean, Machiavelli, when he addresses the topic of tyranny, is unusual in the way that his categories are not really primarily those of law and legal regulations. Normally in the 16th century, when you talk about tyranny, you talk about a form of power which violates legal rules or moral rules. And such categories don't loom very large in Machiavelli's writings. So in that sense, he's not typical in his discourse. And many people in the 16th, 17th century would have argued that a prince, not of course the Discorsi, is a sort of guidebook how to become a tyrant. That may be a misinterpretation, but I mean, still there's material in the Prince which would enable you to read this little book in such a way. So, I mean, was this criticism in the 16th century, at least to some extent, justified? I mean, it's certainly blatant that in the Prince there's little distinction between the hereditary rule of a prince and a prince who just grasps power without any claim to a hereditary right, like Cesare Borgia, for example. So is the Prince a guidebook for tyranny?
No, I don't think so. It certainly is a guidebook for political success. And, we can talk about, I mean, it's a lot obviously to talk about. But now keep in mind, here's something that's interesting as a footnote. He never describes Borgia anywhere as a tyrant, nowhere, which I expected he would have. And I think that is at least indicative of the fact that he distinguishes between the prince and the I mean, his concept of the prince and a tyrant. I mean, he, as I said, doesn't ever use the word tyrant or anything like it in the Prince. And that is the question that, and again, if I had included all the secondary discussion of secondary literature, that is discussed by various people, and they try to explain it in various kinds of ways. But it's the case, and it seems like it's a kind of surprising case. And Borgia is never called a tyrant. On the one hand. On the other hand, remember that Machiavelli is writing The Prince in 1513, maybe a little bit into 1514. What's happened to Borgia by then? Right? He's been imprisoned. He escapes. He raises an army. His army deserts him, and he is killed. In other words, he was not a successful prince. And he was not a successful prince. And again, this is discussed because Machiavelli is right in the middle of this politics. This diplomatic politics. He knows Borgia well. He knows the other players very well. And he says in the legations that Borgia, that essentially Borgia got conned by Julius II. Julius made promises to Borgia. Borgia stupidly believed in them, and it was essentially his downfall. And so Borgia is not, despite the fact that everybody says Borgia is the quintessential prince, he's not, because he failed. And he made important political miscalculations. And by 1514, he is history, literally and figuratively. And people forget that. And I always have to point that out when I'm teaching Machiavelli. I have to point that out to my students, that he and everybody else knew that Borgia had failed. All of his readers would have known that. But in any case, and that's sort of a side note, but you mentioned Borgia, and I always like to bring Borgia up because most people do see him as Machiavelli's quintessential tyrant. He never calls him that. but it's the case that the way in which, so I think it's intentional. He doesn't use the tyranny language in the Prince, because he doesn't consider the prince as he describes him to be a tyrant. Tyrants fail, right? I mean, that's the one lesson as you read throughout the whole corpus. Tyrants fail, and I think, and I mean, this is now just occurring to me as an alternative explanation. And Machiavelli is trying to give advice in The Prince about how to succeed. But across his examples, tyrants always, in one way or another, always fail. They never are able to maintain their power for the reasons I was talking about. And his archetypical tyrants, Appius and the Duke of Athens, Walter Brienne, are just completely example, and they fall very fast, right? They don't engage in tyranny for very long, and they're opposed by some combination of the people or the people and the nobility, but usually it's the people. And so I think that that Machiavelli in The Prince is offering advice not to a tyrant, but he's offering advice. And again, in a longer version of this paper, I definitely would go into it. I didn't have a chance to, but he talks about the humors. He talks about in The Prince. He talks about the nobility versus the people, and gives advice to the prince about how he ought to deal with these two factions, these two inherently conflicting humors. And largely, he says, by gaining the support of the people for a whole bunch of different reasons. But he thinks that the prince, if his advice is followed, or claims to think that if his advice is followed, that the prince will be able to do what tyrants weren't able to do, which is survive.
Just one small objection. I mean, if I were a tyrant, I wouldn't call myself a tyrant, obviously, a defender of the people's right or something like that. Certainly Assad or Putin don't call themselves tyrants openly. And if I were to write a guidebook for tyrants, I wouldn't call it a guidebook for tyrants, but a guidebook for just rule or order and justice or something like that. So the mere absence of the word tyrant, I think, is perhaps not in itself a conclusive argument.
Well, I mean, I think it's indicative. And as I've tried to show, on the one hand, there are diverse uses of the word tyrant, that there's not a entirely consistent theory, right? And I admit that without any problem, that he uses tyrant in equivocal ways. But I do think when he goes most into detail about tyrants and tyranny, there are some systematic elements there that gesture towards, at any rate, a conception of tyranny. Now, in fact, keep in mind that what you're saying isn't exactly true, because there are writings that precede Machiavelli. I've written about it. I have an article in Contributions to the History of Concepts called three concepts of tyranny in medieval Latin world, something like that. And you have to remember that there are of course the classic critics of tyrants, right? But there are also two other kinds of approaches that you see in, for instance, people like Bartolus, who writes a De Tyrannia, in which he effectively defends some forms of tyranny. And in fact, it's been one of the interpretations, you mentioned law, one of the interpretations that has come up in recent time is precisely that Machiavelli is following along in a Bartolian tradition. I don't think it's right, but it certainly addresses some of your considerations. Yeah, people were writing about tyranny well before Machiavelli, and they were justifying it. They were saying it's not entirely a bad thing. And so there's more going on there, Ronald, than you might think, right? That it's either tyrants or kings. I mean, that's the old approach. but in fact there are there's more subtlety in what's going on in the tradition leading up to Machiavelli, vis-a-vis tyrants. People are willing to write about and to some extent justify tyranny.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, and these aren't crazy people, by the way. I mean,
can I ask another question? Huh?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Because I also wrote our short entry on Machiavelli, and I wrote too much to summarize it. So, but I remember reading one interesting thought that Machiavelli's worldview was relatively small. It was Tuscany, like the Regnum Italia. It was not really like mostly northern Italy. So he didn't have this overview of these different political regimes that he knew close by. So he was familiar with France, as he saw like a traditional, well-established king, and then he was more looking like the newer principalities in Italy. But while he, of course, like goes back to the Roman Empire, like I've seen one of the interpretations of what is Machiavelli. Is he advising how to become a tyrant? Is he, as Rousseau called him, the avant-garde, instructing the people how these regimes work and how democracy should be established? That I read a nice interpretation, but I don't know by who it was. It might be Pocop, it might be Viroli, don't remember exactly, who actually wrote that Machiavelli was nostalgic towards a reintegrated Italy back on the scale of
right.
the Roman Empire,
and led by Florence, explicitly led by Florence. Right. He wanted to. I think he wanted to reconstitute as his sort of big picture project is reconstitute the unity of Italy that the Romans had achieved, but under the leadership of Florence. And I think there's good evidence, and certainly one advocate of that interpretation. There's a book by Mikhail Hornquist called Machiavelli and Empire, and came out. It's been probably a dozen years or more, but he, in fact, pursues that interpretation quite extensively, and I think it makes perfect sense. Now, I have to disagree with you about factual matters, and that is Machiavelli traveled widely. He spent a lot of time at a lot of courts, including France, including the emperor, including the German emperor, as well as in southern Italy, or central and southern Italy. And yes, was he a sort of a Tuscan patriot? I think so. Certainly a Florentine patriot. I mean, he, after all, said on more than one, or wrote on more than one occasion, that he loved his country more than his life. And the country, patria, there means Florence. But on the other hand, I think it's unfair to say that he had limited experience. He had tremendous experience. And the way in which what you got to do is go back and read the stuff he wrote before the Prince, which virtually no one does. Read the whole of the legations. Read the little tracts he wrote on France and on the Empire, which, as I said, is this is actually the book I just published on Machiavelli, my most recent book on Machiavelli, which is called The Rope and the Chains: Machiavelli's Early Thought and Its Transformations. And essentially, I do what, in terms of looking at it from a political theory perspective, what literally nobody else has done, which is to go back through all that stuff and look at it not from the perspective of, as some people have said, you can ignore all that, that's just, crap. Or some people have said, no, everything important about Machiavelli is, in later times, so starting with the Prince, is there. Neither of those claims are true. In fact, certainly there are some themes that he starts to grapple with in his early writings. But I think there is a break with Machiavelli starting with the Prince. And of course, the reference to the rope and chains is his being arrested. And this is how he describes his situation in a sonnet that he dedicates to Giuliano de' Medici, who has, of course, put him in jail. But he describes his circumstances, the rope, of course, referring to the strappato, the chains referring to the chains around his feet that he's kept in captivity in. And I think, without being psychological or psychologizing here, I do think that a lot of Machiavelli's concepts are much more highly articulated in the Prince. One example is he does not ever use the word virtù, which of course is, absolutely crucial Machiavellian concept. It to mean what we think of as classic virtù in any of his preprints writings, never. So in other words, he's not describing Borgia, who, as I said, he knows well and spends a lot of time at Borgia's court and observes what Borgia firsthand, how Borgia's his strategies. Borgia doesn't have virtù, neither does anybody else. He just doesn't talk about it in those terms. And a lot of his key concepts that we associate with, the mature Machiavelli simply are not there, surprisingly. But the problems that leads him to articulate those concepts are there. So there is a relationship between early writing and late writing, but it's not a direct one. As I said, usually that material, especially the legations, is only used for biographical material. It virtually never is read on its own terms, as this being Machiavelli in his analysis of politics and related topics. And the stuff is just fascinating, but you have to read it carefully.
Okay, thank you. If I may, I would like to ask a question concerning Machiavelli's sources and his relationship to the tradition of political thought. Before I do that, I'm thinking about the earlier question by Jeroen about the despotism versus tyranny. So Aristotle, in the first book of Politics, he uses the term. He divides power into despotike, politique, and basilike. So that despotic,
right, yes.
political and royal or kingly, and the despotic power is of a master over his slaves in a domestic context. But as far as I know, the political thought in the Middle Ages is focused on the distinction between the regal and political, and right. So the despotic, for some reason, that doesn't become a term that would be widely used, I think, on the one hand, and on the other hand, probably because of Latin and not Greek is the dominant language. Maybe that is why despotic doesn't come up as an important term. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question. I mean, when and how this term exactly appeared. It's a Greek term, so probably through Byzantium's influence or something like that. But I don't know exactly. But in terms of sources, so would you agree with what Blythe says, namely that Machiavelli is much more dependent on the medieval political theory than is assumed, or than Machiavelli himself wants his readers to believe? So what are his main sources? Because what is his use of Polybius, for instance? Because that's a new source, of course. But I'm just asking out of ignorance, because I checked that Polybius's, Editio Princeps, the first printed edition of Polybius is 1529, apparently. So what was the knowledge of Polybius's writings at the beginning of the 16th century? What is the meaning of it and significance of it? And so what, in general, what is Machiavelli's use of the earlier authorities and the tradition?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be said about that. But I'm sure you folks want to have dinner, so I won't go on too long. That it's an interesting question about despotism, because now remember, Machiavelli doesn't have any Greek, right? He's well educated, but it's all in Latin sources, as well as, of course, Italian vernacular sources. And so it's the case that Machiavelli's knowledge of Aristotle is going to come through Bruni's translation of the Politics, which is a wonderful translation. The original translation from by William of Moerbeke in the mid-14th century is a mess. And it's a mess because he just transliterates anything he doesn't understand, he transliterates. And doesn't, makes no effort to explain, which is why there's so many commentaries on the politics. But it's an interesting question. I have to go back and look at it. How Bruni translates despotism into Italian, and whether, that's actually a great question. I'm just making a note on this, and whether that terminology shows up at all in Machiavelli's writings. This goes back to the question about Montesquieu. And I've sort of always regarded Montesquieu's distinction there as being, you never say, completely unique, but as being sort of the best worked out way of making that distinction. But I'd have to look at that, because Machiavelli certainly knew the politics, but he knew it in that particular translation. He would have. It was widely regarded and widely distributed. Polybius is another problem. And I've written widely about this. Polybius, there's a question about, of course, books 1 through 5 complete were all translated in the 15th century. Polybius, book 6, which is of course what's important, there are real questions about its dissemination. How early it was possibly disseminated in Greek and or in Latin. There are multiple theories. There's one theory that Machiavelli knew it from a work by Bernardo Rosselli on the city of Rome, De Urbe Roma, that had to have been written before. That had to have been written before 1504, I think, and disseminated. Of course, Machiavelli has close connections with the Rosselli family. And so that's one hypothesis. I've actually looked at that text, and the Rosselli text in an early, I think it may have been actually the original edition. And it's the whole Polybian theory of anacyclosis isn't there. So there are a lot of questions. Interestingly, if you look at his presumed adaptation of Polybius in book 1, everybody translates kingship, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, and democracy and ochlocracy, mob rule. What's interesting is that Machiavelli doesn't actually he uses tyranny, he uses kingship. He does not use democracy. He talks about the rule of the many. He does not use oligarchy or aristocracy. He talks about the rule of the few, the good and the bad rule of the few. And he uses the word ochlocracy, however, interesting. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So he doesn't take over Polybius's actual language, and which is a head scratcher. And I've pointed that out in work I've done on Polybius and the reception of Polybius, but I haven't quite figured out what's going on there. In fact, in my most recent paper on that topic, I actually say what's going on here, without offering a solution. So it's the case that for Machiavelli, what he knew of Polybius and how he knew it is up in the air. you're certainly right that the fragments of 6 that exist aren't translated until much later, until after his death. The parts of the work are known, and in fact, who was it? It was either Jim Hankins or what's his other? I can't think of it. I'm trying to think of the name of the other scholar who discovered that there are fragments that exist of Book 6 that were probably translated by Jean Lascaris, who's an amazing figure in that period of time. There are 2 fragments, and it's possible that there was more to that. That's another hypothesis, is that he had access somehow to Lascaris's translation. But the question is how. There's been a big controversy about whether Machiavelli actually knew Lascaris. It's possible, but the connection hasn't quite been made in terms of where and how. They both traveled widely, and they were at the same courts and the same cities, but it appears at different times. For example, Lascaris was in Florence when Machiavelli was away on diplomatic missions. And we have, and that's documented. So could they have met at Florence? Unlikely. Lascaris spent a lot of time at the court of the King of France. And of course, Machiavelli did as well. But again, not at the same time. So this is a question that's very much, it has been very widely debated. And I've got, as I said, in a volume that came out a couple of years ago on Machiavelli's discourses, there's a chapter in there in which I summarize sort of the problems, try to offer, and then summarize the problems that are raised, some of the scholarly solutions, and then try to go for it myself in terms of what I thought might be the most likely explanation. My own explanation is that, and of course, this is one of those that winds up being imponderable, is that there was in fact a translation kicking around, and that it's essentially, it was probably in manuscript and it's now lost. One bit of evidence, interestingly, and this is Jim Hankins. It was both a freestanding article and it's in an adapted fashion in his book on virtue politics, which is that in the 1440s. There was a kind of a marginal humanist figure who uses the word ochlocracy. Now, that is a word that is unique to Polybius, first of all. And second of all, it is a word that, and Jim, who's one of the great Renaissance humanist scholars, 15th, 16th century scholars, Jim did a search far and wide. It's not used by anyone else in that time or for a long period thereafter. In other words, it is totally unique, which suggests that there is something, either a Greek manuscript or a Latin translation of 6, that was available much earlier than anybody suspected. And that's intriguing, right? And Hankins finds it, I don't know if I would say dispositive, but certainly finds it very interesting that in this one case, you have language that is specifically Polybian, that is clearly being used in the 1440s, long before 6 was known, and in any way, shape, or form, fragmentary or whatever. So, as I said, there are just so many different elements to that particular problem. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating. But positing, the problem, of course, is it's Occam's razor, right? Positing something that we don't have evidence of, like a manuscript, is very difficult to do, except for this ochlocracy problem. So, yeah. I think there's some questions chat. I've been
Yeah,
talking.
we have a question from Mariusz Escua about Antonio Gramsci and his reading of Machiavelli. I'll just read what is in the chat box. So Gramsci put his thought in the field of theory of revolution and communism, political strategy, and has seen Prince as a text in which there was a kind of communism promise. And the modern Prince, Gramsci wrote about Napoleonism, which could be seen as a form of tyranny, form of false representation of the people, in contrast to the future Communist Party, which he sees as a historical equivalent of the Prince. So how do you find Gramsci's text in your research on tyranny and on Machiavelli in general? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. And it's the case that that I hadn't thought about that. There has been some good work done on that. Ben Fontana published a book on Machiavelli and Gramsci, which I think was based on his dissertation a number of years ago. And there have been discussions about that. You know, in my view, Gramsci isn't an interpretation of Machiavelli in the sense of a scholarly interpretation, which is the case. Which is not surprising, right? I mean, Machiavelli is obviously an important and traditionally important figure in the history of Italian philosophy. And of course, there's a whole controversy about the Italian tradition of philosophy that I won't even go into. But it's the case that it seems to me Gramsci is as many people do, is appropriating Machiavelli for his own needs. Rather than trying to give a scholarly reading, an academic reading of Machiavelli. And obviously that the latter is what I'm trying to do. So I don't have any immediate thoughts about that. I haven't read the new Prince or Gramsci's prison notebooks in, I don't know, probably well more than a couple of decades. And I would have to go back and give that some thought. Jerome, you had pointed out the work by Giorgini, which in fact he published an article in History of Political Thought on that same material. I give an account of that in the full paper, talking about the secondary literature. My main issue with his work is that he limits himself to basically the discourses and the Prince. In other words, he doesn't look at the whole picture of Machiavelli's writings. It's interesting as far as it goes, but it's not. But it is a different kind of project than what I'm working on, and a different kind of approach. And whereas I'm going at, okay, what did Machiavelli? Let's go through all the text carefully and see what Machiavelli actually said across a range of his writings, and working from that very specific kind of textual basis, which is the kind of thing I did in the Rope and the Chains book as well. Is okay, let's actually figure out how Machiavelli is using language, because he's a very conscious writer in terms of his use of language. He's a very precise writer. He's not sloppy. And so I think that I found that article interesting, the History of Political Thought article I'm talking about, interesting, but I don't think that it is taking the same kind of approach. And this is true for Leo Strauss talks about, Machiavellian tyranny. There are a couple of other articles. There's a new book. Hankins, Virtue Politics, talks about Machiavellian tyranny. There's a very new book by John Najimi that has a long chapter on Machiavellian tyranny and so forth. But again, the problem is they stick to a couple of the main writings and don't look systematically through the range of Machiavelli's writings. And I think that is, in terms of what I'm trying to do, that is a very different kind of approach, and it leads to different kinds of conclusions. And as I think I said, my last line is that in what I read, and it's the last line of the paper as it exists, is that it's a chastened conclusion, but I can't go any farther than that in terms of the actual evidence. And I've become more evidence-based as I've gotten older in terms of reading Machiavelli. Is all right. Let's look at what he said, and not just what he said in a couple of texts. Obviously important texts, but nevertheless not the only things he wrote. 3,000 pages in critical edition is pretty substantial.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interesting question, and again, I'm going to again, in the full paper, and this is very much a work in progress. I'm going to deal with precisely his work and what I think are its limitations.
Are there any other questions or remarks on what we've been discussing? I wanted to return for a moment to what you said earlier about the ochlocracy. So,
right.
So have I understood correctly that Machiavelli does use this Polybian term?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. Machiavelli does.
No.
No.
Did you say
no? No. Machiavelli. I can't remember. But I think he uses mob rule.
Okay.
I mean,
so he doesn't use the Greek term or the Latinized Greek term. He doesn't.
No, and I think I mistakenly said that before.
Okay.
But no, except for tyranny and kingship, he doesn't use he doesn't use the language of Polybius at all. Right? He doesn't say aristocracy, democracy. He doesn't say. And as I said, this is strange.
Okay. But I wanted to ask, when he discusses the mob rule, because you said that in your paper you say that Machiavelli doesn't really believe in the tyranny of the many because there's too many of them.
Well, I offered that as speculation.
So does he, when he discusses the rule of the mob, does he link it in any way to tyranny, or tyranny is just something he discusses when he talks about the corruption of kingship or things like that, or a possible tyranny of the few? So
yeah, that's a good question, but the answer is that for him, the bad form of the rule of the few, which is mob rule, isn't a form of government.
Of the many, the bad form of the rule of the many.
Right, and he uses the rule of the many, not democracy. But it is when liberty becomes license, which of course is another theme that's worth exploring in his writing, because he does talk about that from time to time. But it's no longer effectively a system of government. It's anarchy in effect, which is not a term he uses. It is why? Because mob rule is no longer the love of liberty, right? And the people throughout his writings, the people are characterized, the popolo, the plebs, whatever, characterized by specifically a love of liberty and the desire not to be dominated by the nobility. And that's not what mob rule is. It's no longer a love of liberty.
So he doesn't describe it as an excessive love of liberty. Is it not an excess? Okay.
He makes the distinction between, and again, throughout his writings, between liberty and license.
Okay.
And license is not liberty as he understands liberty. Right. And and in fact, that's something that should and could be investigated in his writings. I mean, there's something to discuss there about how he uses license. But in the places I can think of, license is almost it's not too much liberty. In a sense, there's no such thing as too much liberty as he understands liberty. It is a whole different.
How would you define his understanding of liberty? Does he give a definition of it?
Sure. It's liberty is non-domination, right? If I can switch over to Pettit and Skinner, and I have real issues with Pettit and Skinner, but I think it's true that he says this over and over and over again, right? He uses command or domination, or dominion rather, versus liberty. Desire for dominion, desire to command is the quintessential characteristic of the nobility. The desire to be free from command. Liberty is the quintessential characteristic of the popolo. But liberty isn't license. Liberty doesn't mean just doing whatever you want. It means essentially collective self-government of the people.
Okay.
Without having to answer to the nobility who want to beat up on the people. And it is literally beat up. I mean, that's in the text. Batter.
Thank you.
Yep.
I had an impression while listening to your talk, but maybe that's entirely wrong. But I think that you sort of emphasized in a way the importance of excess versus restraint in Machiavelli's discussion of tyranny, which made me think about of course the idea of the limitation of power, not only the limitation by the rule of law, but the limitation of various social groups by each other. And isn't there, that doesn't make any sense that for Machiavelli this is important, the idea of excess versus limitation, restraint, or what would you say?
Well, I think there are two things. And here I would, in terms of scholarship, I'd recommend Gabriele Padula's book, Machiavelli in Tumult, which does a very good job of going over these kinds of issues. In terms of excess versus limit, I think that for Machiavelli, at minimum, the nobility knows no limit, right? That the nobility will grab all the power it can when it has the opportunity to do so. Whereas I think that by a talented ruler, it's the case that he's much more able to, and I think I read that passage, he's much more able to control the people. Now, that can be a prince, or it can be what Machiavelli describes as a tyrant, if he uses the right kind of techniques. If the people have liberty within certain limits, and it's what really struck me in talking about that, and about not being able to find an idea of popular tyranny, right? I mean, where those words are conjoined, of the people exercising tyranny. The thing that really struck me is the point about why wouldn't the people be tyrannical? Precisely because of that love of liberty. Nobles can be tyrannical because they love domination. It's interesting, and it helps to explain why in all of this writing, why he never talks in those terms. I'm going to run this by John McCormick, who, of course, as I said, is the leading expositor of Machiavellian democracy, which is the title of his book, and see how he reacts to it. He might find it interesting, because that's not part of his argument, as far as I'm aware. But I think it's the case that at least for Machiavelli, there's a certain sense in which the people are, because of their commitment to liberty, the people are more restrained ultimately than is the nobility. The only other way to deal with the problem is what Rome did, which is, and this goes back to, I think, Ronald's question, conquer, right? Rome, for a time, Machiavelli thinks, or says in the discourses, and also talks about this in parts of the history of Florence, in some of the introductions to books of history of Florence, that the reason the Romans were uniquely successful, the Roman Republic was uniquely successful, is that the inherent antipathy between grandi and popolo, the inherent conflict, was socialized, was turned outwards, so that that working together, the nobility and the people were able to conquer, right, vast tracts of land. And for him, conquest is the mark of the greatness of a republic. Right? He criticizes Sparta and he criticizes Venice for, while they are stable republics in his view, they are not great republics because they don't conquer. Or at least that's what he says in the discourses. And that's his criticism. And again, that goes back to the question that was asked before about conquest and so forth. A successful republic that conquers is a republic that has managed to not get rid of factions. That's not possible, but rather to bring them together in a common goal. Okay. Grab as much territory as you can.
Thank you. And so on that note, we will wrap up. Thank you once again, Professor Nedermann, for your fascinating lecture. And I want to thank all of you for listening to the talk and for a very interesting and stimulating discussion.
And I want to thank the questions, because I've got a page of notes now based on some of the questions that were being asked, and there's things I'm going to have to, as I continue to work through this paper, things I'm going to have to deal with, or things that I think are useful in terms of integrating. So I really appreciate the questions.
Thank you again, and see you next time.
Okay, good. Take care.
Good
Bye now.
Bye-bye.